Hello and welcome to my latest tutorial video on Unit 3.3 Energy Systems, and today we're going to be talking about the lactic acid system. So when we talk about our energy systems, essentially all of them are attempting to provide energy for the resynthesis of ATP. And if you're not quite sure what ATP is, go back a couple of videos and watch the video on respiration and ATP, and that will explain what ATP is and how it gets constantly broken down and built back up again. But essentially, ATP is the energy currency for our body, and that's the format in which energy is used in our body. So the energy systems are what we use to recreate or resynthesize this ATP. So we have the ATP-PC system, the lactic acid system, and then the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. Now the first two of these, the ATP-PC system and the lactic acid system, they are anaerobic, so that means that they don't require the presence of oxygen. The second two, the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain, they're aerobic, so they do require the presence of oxygen to completely break down the glucose and provide energy. So in the previous video we talked about stored ATP. So because this isn't actually a process by which ATP is resynthesized, it is just the simple breakdown of the ATP that's stored in your muscle, stored ATP isn't considered an energy system as such. It's just the fact that you store some ATP and it gets broken down for immediate use in your muscles. So today we're going to talk about the lactic acid system. So here we have a diagram of the different energy systems, and we're starting off, as you can see on the left hand side here, with glucose. Glucose is a 6-carbon sugar, as you can see from the number of different C's just here, so 6 carbons. And that's going to be important in a little bit. So the first step of this process is a process called glycolysis. And this is the breakdown of glucose into pyruvate. Now what happens to that pyruvate will depend on whether oxygen is or isn't present. If oxygen isn't present, then lactic acid is produced, hence the name of the system, the lactic acid system. And this is a process of fermentation which takes place without the presence of oxygen. If, however, oxygen is present, then the pyruvate goes forward into the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. So just to try to get your head around this, glycolysis always takes place and pyruvate is always produced at the end of glycolysis. What happens to that pyruvate depends on whether oxygen is present or absent. So in this case, no oxygen is present, it's anaerobic, and so lactic acid is formed. So what is glycolysis? Well, we can look at the word and we can try and work out what it means. So lysis, as we know from previous videos, is the splitting of, and glyco meaning glucose. So glycolysis is the splitting of glucose. And it's a partial breakdown of glucose into pyruvate, and it takes place in the cytoplasm of all cells. So this here is a diagram of the process of glycolysis. So as you can see, it's horrifically complicated, and luckily for you, you don't have to memorize all this. But there are some important things to take from this diagram. So we start with, at the top of the diagram here, we start with our glucose molecule. And as we discussed, it's a 6-carbon molecule. And that's quite important, because what then happens halfway down is that our 6-carbon molecule breaks into 2 3-carbon molecules. Okay, so we have one on the left and one on the right. So 2 3-carbon molecules are produced. So ultimately, when we produce pyruvate, we produce 2 molecules of pyruvate. So each single molecule of glucose produces 2 molecules of pyruvate. Other things that take place in the system are, we have in the initial part, we have an energy investment phase. So this is where ATP is actually used up in this system. But it then gets repaid later in the energy generation phase. So although we use up 2 ATPs in the investment phase, we get back 4 ATPs in the energy generation phase. So therefore that leads to a net gain of 2 ATP molecules. We also produce NADH, and all you need to know is that NADH is an electron carrier. So it carries electrons, and that's going to come into play in the electron transport chain much later. To try and simplify this, we've got glucose being broken down into 2 pyruvate molecules, and as you can see, this is a 3-carbon molecule. 1, 2, 3 carbons there. Produces a net gain of 2 ATP, being produced from 2 ADP, and it also produces some NADH. As we say, NADH is just a coenzyme, and it takes up and releases hydrogen ions, so it's an electron carrier. Now, as we said earlier, what happens to this pyruvate at the end of glycolysis will be determined by the presence or absence of oxygen. So in this case, we're working anaerobically, so there's no oxygen present. So because we're working anaerobically, lactic acid is produced. This lactic acid then limits the amount of ATP which can be produced. So as you can see, our 2-pyruvate gets converted into 2-lactate. So the lactic acid system is also known as anaerobic glycolysis, so the splitting of glucose in an anaerobic environment, hence it's known as anaerobic glycolysis. So the splitting of glucose in an anaerobic environment. So another word for the lactic acid system is anaerobic glycolysis. And it results, as we say, in the production of lactic acid, hence the name of the system. So more video you can watch just here using the QR code. Lactic acid, the product of this system, can cause muscle fatigue and inhibit the production of ATP as the pH drops and inhibits many of the enzymes which are involved in the production of ATP. So just to summarise then, anaerobic glycolysis, or the lactic acid system, breaks down glucose to form 2 pyruvate molecules. So this is performed by all life on Earth, and it's performed in the cytoplasm of the cell. Overall, glycolysis produces 4 ATPs and 2 NADH, but it uses, don't forget, 2 ATPs, so therefore there's a net gain of 2 ATP and 2 NADH. So if there's no oxygen present, the pyruvate is then converted into lactic acid. If there is oxygen present, it's converted into acetyl-CoA and enters the Krebs cycle. That's what we're going to look at in the next video. In the meantime, if you'd like to take the test on the lactic acid system, please click on the link here. Thanks very much.